The Louvre, one of the largest palaces in the world. A former royal residence, enlarged, embellished over the years. Epitomized here are 8 centuries of architectural history. The entire building has now been converted into a museum for everyone's benefit. Within these walls, among the masterpieces that await us, some of the works have existed for 5,000 years. Coming around the floor pavilion, we approach the Louvre through a symbolic gateway, the triumphal Arch of the Carousel, built during the reign of Napoleon I. Most of the harmonious facades on either side and behind it were constructed when Napoleon III decided to extend the old Louvre to house the museum and his imperial officers. The statues of famous men look down from the terraces lining the courtyard. High on a pedestal stands Bernini's fiery equestrian statue of Louis XIV. Rather than the original marble in 1989, the architect Yeo Ming-pei placed a dark grey lead cast here that matched the palace roofs. It was Pei who designed the Louvre Museum's main underground entrance, covering it with a glass pyramid that adds light and volume to a vast reception area. The architect wanted the pyramid to be transparent and to reflect the sky. From the inside, reached via a remarkable spiral staircase, the walls of the palace to which it leads can be seen. Three possible directions, 3 names, 3 wings of the museum. Sully, for the building surrounding the Cour Carrée, or the square courtyard. Richelieu, for the ones running along the Rue de Rivoli. Denon, for the part bordering the River Seine. Sully was Henry IV's Minister of Finance. Cardinal Richelieu was Louis XIII's minister. Denon was the director of the Central Museum of Arts under Napoleon I. The Louvre's 7 departments extend over the different levels of these 3 wings. Ancient Near Eastern antiquities, Egyptian antiquities, Greek, Etruscan and Roman antiquities, sculpture, decorative arts, paintings, graphic arts. The Richelieu Wing. The Department of Ancient Near Eastern Antiquities houses the finds of the French excavations undertaken from the mid-19th century onwards in Mesopotamia, Iran and the Levant. It was in southern Mesopotamia, in the land of Sumer, that writing made its first appearance in 3300 BC. The earliest texts were bookkeeping documents. Pictograms, then cuneiform characters, were used to count animals or keep a record of the crops. One of sculpture's earliest functions was to commemorate victories on the battlefield. The stele of the vultures was erected in about 2450 BC by Ananetum, king of Lagash, to celebrate his triumph over the neighboring town of Umma. The sovereign, clad in a sheepskin skirt, is seen here marching at the head of his troops. His enemies have been caught in a huge net. E.B. Ill, a high-ranking official, possibly the equivalent of a minister of finance, was governor of the powerful city of Mari in about 2400 BC. Like Ananetum, E.B. Ill is dressed in a skirt made of tufts of wool called a konakes. His eyes are inlaid with shell and lapis lazuli. The Louvre owns a series of black diorite figures of Gudea, Prince of the state of Lagash. They all date to about 2150 BC. They were intended to perpetuate the prayers the prince offered to the city's protective deities. One of the most outstanding shows the prince holding a vase against his chest with water, the symbol of life, gushing forth full of fish. In the 18th century BC, Hammurabi was king of Babylon. He imposed his rule over the whole of Mesopotamia. The stele that bears his name is over 2 meters high and shows him standing before the sun god Shamash. A long inscription engraved on basalt in cuneiform characters lists nearly 300 laws concerning the family, marriage, divorce, adoption, inheritance, and theft. It is one of the most ancient compendiums of common law in the history of mankind. 1,000 years were to pass between Hammurabi's reign and that of Sargon II, king of Assyria, who built his capital near Nineveh on the site of the present-day Iraqian village of Khorsabad in northern Mesopotamia. The palace entrances were guarded by winged bulls with human heads and sacred tiaras. Giants capable of strangling lions personified strength and courage, benevolence to palace guests, and a threat to enemies. The reliefs decorating the courtyards and the rooms of the palace were over 2 kilometers long and depicted processions of dignitaries or vanquished peoples and the transportation of cedar from Lebanon to be used in the construction of the palace. In the Suli wing, on the northern side of the square courtyard, the Department of Near Eastern Antiquities presents its Iranian collections. The most famous pieces came from the excavations carried out by the Louvre in the late 19th century in western Iran, and more specifically at Susa. This was where Darius built a palace in the late 6th century BC, before the one he constructed in his other capital, Persepolis. Darius's palace at Susa had an audience chamber adorned with columns, the Apadana, one of whose capitals is now in the Louvre. Its walls were covered in glazed brick friezes representing processions of animals or parades of archers in ceremonial dress. And lastly, in this ancient Near Eastern section come the pieces from the countries of the Levant, from northern Syria and Anatolia, from Cyprus and Palestine, Byblos, Ugarit, Palmyra. A few decades before the rediscovery of the biblical Near East, when the Egyptian collections entered the Louvre, the museum set itself a new goal: to exhibit archaeological evidence that threw light on the history of the very ancient civilizations. Today, the Department of Egyptian Antiquities still follows the principle adopted by its original curator, Jean-François Champollion, the man who first deciphered hieroglyphics. The major themes of the pharaonic civilizations are presented on the ground floor of the square courtyard. A chronological display covering 4,000 years of Egyptian art history is on the first floor. The ancient civilization of the Nile developed a very wide range of crafts. A prolific number of pieces testify to the everyday lifestyles of the royal families and their attendants, of members of the court and officials. Bronze mirrors, musical instruments, harp, lyre, and drum. We are very familiar with the day-to-day lives of ancient Egyptians, as they believed in helping the deceased to continue their existence in the afterworld. In their tombs or the adjacent chapels, they left all the necessities of life, either in the form of models, a boat, a house, or in painted and sculpted scenes. Akhethetep was a person who in about 2400 BC was granted the right to place his tomb near the pyramid in which the king he had served was buried at Saqqara. A funerary chapel was built over the tomb. This building takes its name from the Arab word mastaba. The walls were covered in bas-reliefs showing scenes of navigation, laying in supplies, catching birds, and making offerings. In the early Middle Kingdom around the year 2000 BC, tombs frequently contained figurines of hippopotamuses. The pottery was painted with plants from the marshland where the animals lived. The deceased could thus partake in the joys of hunting forever. Still faithful to Champollion's ideas, the Louvre has organized a thematic presentation focusing here on writing and scribes' activities, here on work in the fields, and elsewhere on costume and games. An immense space has been set aside for the evocation of a temple, from the approach lined with sphinxes to the courtyards and the series of rooms leading to the inner sanctum, the naos, which housed the statue of the divinity. Funerary rites and equipment are on view in the Osiris crypt, home to the massive pink granite sarcophagus of Ramses III. Another gallery contains an impressive collection of coffins placed upright. Other rooms present the mummies of animals and figurines of funerary attendants. On the first floor is a panorama of Egyptian art ranging from the 4th millennium BC to the reign of Cleopatra VII in the 1st century BC. The so-called stele of the Serpent King dates to about 3100 BC and bears the name of a 1st dynasty sovereign who identified with the falcon god Horus. The serpent seen in a palace courtyard is a hieroglyph representing the letters DJ. The name of King Vaji thus appears on the stele. The scribe played a major role in royal administration. This painted limestone statue was found by the French archaeologist Mariette in the cemetery at Saqqara in 1850. It is one of the oldest and best-known masterpieces of Egyptian art. The white stone eyes are outlined in copper and inlaid with rock crystal. Representations of the sovereign, the pharaoh, followed a fixed set of rules. That is why all these portraits are rather similar. A statue of a pharaoh is most frequently identified from the inscription it bears, as this one here of Thutmose IV. Yet occasionally, more individualized features are found, as in these portraits of Akhenaten, whose reign brought about dramatic but fleeting changes to both artistic canons and religious practices. The rooms converted during Charles X's reign from 1826 onwards to house the collections curated by Champollion have been preserved at the Louvre. Works dating to the last centuries of pharaonic Egypt are displayed in a setting designed in the 1820s by the architect Pierre Fontaine. After the conquest of Alexander the Great, Egypt was first Hellenized, then Romanized. In a vast underground space, well suited to the presentation of funerary equipment, Roman Egypt is represented by stelae, painted wooden coffins, mask breastplates, hangings, and portraits on wooden panels, most of which were discovered in the oasis of Fayoum. After the Roman period, ancient Egypt came under the sway of the Byzantine Greeks, otherwise known as the Copts. This name was a deformation of the Greek word Aegyptos, which meant Egyptian, but was reserved for Christianized Egyptians. The Louvre owns an extensive collection of Coptic art, now occupying the part of the palace allocated to late antiquity. This collection includes textiles, bronzes, ceramics, as well as a partially reconstituted church from the site at Bawit. A famous painting on wood depicts Christ, on the right, placing his arm protectively around the shoulders of Abbot Mina, superior of the monastery at Bawit. This panel is thought to date to the early 7th century. Egypt was an entirely Christian land when the Arab conquest began in 641. Less than 100 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, the Arabs had brought Islam not only to Egypt and Syria, but also to Mesopotamia and Iran, before moving on to Spain and India. This cylindrical box or pyxis was carved out of a single piece of ivory in 10th century Cordoba. Inscribed around the bottom of the lid is the name Prince Al-Mughira. Made in Syria in the early 14th century, this bowl was hammered out of a sheet of brass, then chased and inlaid with engraved gold and silver. Once kept in the treasury of the chapel of the Château de Vincennes, it is traditionally known as the Baptistry of Saint-Louis. In the 16th century, the workshops of Iznik in Turkey supplied the Ottoman court with luxury articles. This plate, adorned with a peacock surrounded by flowers, dates to this time. The Ottoman Turks seized Constantinople in 1453. The fall of the Byzantine Empire is generally regarded as the end of the Middle Ages. On view in the Department of Decorative Arts are works testifying to Byzantine culture, such as this ivory leaf from a 6th century diptych, which probably shows a triumphant Emperor Justinian, or this lapis lazuli icon from Saint-Denis Abbey's treasury, dating to the first half of the 12th century. This serpentine pattern used to hold the host during Mass was made out of an antique green stone saucer inlaid with 7 tiny golden fish and a broad surround decorated with precious stones. It was produced in the 9th century Carolingian workshop, no doubt located in Saint-Denis. Holding pride of place in the vast gallery of medieval objects are the vases commissioned by Suger, the abbot of Saint-Denis. This liturgical ewer was made out of an antique porphyry vase, mounted in the form of an eagle, an idea that came from the abbot himself. This Virgin and Child from the Sainte-Chapelle's treasury was made in one of the Parisian workshops active in the time of Saint-Louis, that set a lasting fashion for ivory carving. From the 13th century onwards, the kings of France kept their regalia, the sword, spurs and scepter used during this coronation ceremony, in Saint-Denis Abbey. The sword might have been used during the coronation of Philip Augustus in 1179. The scepter belonged to Charles V. Before setting off to join the Crusades in 1190, Philip Augustus had a protective wall built around the city of Paris. In front of this rampart, a fortress, the Louvre, kept a lookout for enemies coming up the river Seine. 200 years later, the city had grown in size and the fortress had lost its defensive role. Charles V converted it into a royal residence. Recent excavations have uncovered the foundations of the fortress. Visitors can now walk around the former moat. The pier of the drawbridge is still visible. The medieval castle was gradually demolished in the 16th and 17th centuries to make way for the palace surrounding what from then on was known as the Square Courtyard. King Francois I had the keep razed to the ground. He then asked the architect Pierre Lescot, assisted by the sculptor Jean Goujon, to design a new building to replace the west wing of the old castle. Construction began under Henry II and continued during the reigns of his successors with the addition of new wings, ending under Louis XIV with Claude Perrault and Louis Le Vaux's colonnade. West of the city, about 500 meters from the Louvre, construction of another palace, the Tuileries, for Catherine de' Medici had begun in 1563. Between 1595 and 1607, Henry IV had these two royal residences joined together by the Small Gallery and the Great Riverside Gallery. The Louvre gives us a vivid picture of the different episodes in its long history, especially of the period when it was the seat of the monarchy, from the moment Francois I settled in Paris to the time Louis XIV left for Versailles. The Department of Greek, Etruscan and Roman Antiquities is located in the area specifically related to this monarchical period. But in order to approach its collections chronologically, we must head towards a low gallery built during the Second Empire. Our introduction to ancient Greek art, whose history is fully represented at the Louvre, is a most enigmatic one, with these strange idols from the Cyclades, which are nearly 5,000 years old. The attitude, costume and limestone medium of this small statue, known since 1907 as the Auxerre Goddess, seem typical of Cretan sculpture of the late 7th century BC. 6th century Greece lives on in the Louvre with this tall female statue, or Kori, dedicated to the goddess Hera in her sanctuary on the island of Samos, and this marble bequeathed to the museum by the collector Georges Rampin. A graceful smile hovers on the lips of the victorious horseman. In the late 6th century BC, Etruria, which had not yet been absorbed into the Roman Empire, witnessed the apogee of a distinctive civilization. One of its masterpieces is this terracotta sarcophagus of a married couple. The deceased came from a high-ranking family and are portrayed in the pose traditionally adopted at a banquet. The sarcophagus of a married couple was part of the treasure amassed in the 19th century by the Marquis Campana, a great Roman collector whose estate was purchased by Napoleon III. Part of his collection was transferred to the Louvre in 1863. Not only did Etruscan works and paintings by the Italian primitives enter the museum in this way, but also a collection of Greek ceramics that is regarded as the finest in the world. Parallel to the Campana Gallery, the rooms converted for the museum during Charles X's reign follow on from those used by Champollion. Since 1997, they have housed a prolific collection of Greek terracotta figurines and reliefs. Female statuettes and domestic scenes bear witness to the infinitely varied production of the Greek world from the 7th to the 1st century BC. Nearby, in the area occupied by the former royal apartments, our attention is held by the diversity of Greek jewelry and glassware, or Roman gold and silverwork, whose craftsmanship reached its peak with the Boscoriali treasure, found in a villa near Pompeii in 1895. Most of the large Greek bronze statuary was melted down at an early date to be used for other purposes. But at least the Apollo of Piombino, dating to the 1st century BC, has managed to survive. Victory of Samothrace once stood on a rocky promontory overlooking the waves to commemorate a sea battle. It now stands at the top of a specially built staircase. Just as famous is the Aphrodite, discovered on the island of Milos in the Aegean Sea in 1820, now known to the world as the Venus de Milo. The battling warrior was probably fighting an opponent on horseback and once wore a shield on his left arm. The statue was found south of Rome in the early 17th century and belonged to the collection of the Borghese family. It is still called the Borghese Gladiator. One of the rooms most steeped in history, and also one of the most splendid, owes its name to the caryatids sculpted by Jean Goujon that support a gallery where musicians used to play. It was the scene of many memorable festivities and fatal conspiracies. Molière even performed there before the king. At the end of the 17th century, it was called the Antiques Room. It used to house the crown collections of sculpture, in particular Greek and Roman marbles. Today, the Caryatids Room houses marbles that were made in Roman times. Though they all drew their inspiration from the works of the last Greek period, it is not always clear whether they are mere copies, adaptations, variations, or derivations of a hypothetical classical model. Marsyas, an aged satyr, defeated in a musical contest after daring to challenge Apollo, is seen hanging from a tree, waiting to be flayed alive. Anne of Austria, who acted as regent while her son Louis XIV was a minor, had her summer apartments on the ground floor of the small gallery. Its ceilings are still decorated with paintings by the Italian Romanelli. This is where the Roman collections are displayed today at the Louvre. An entire gallery is reserved for portraits. Livia, the wife of Augustus. Agrippina, Nero's mother. The Emperor Caligula. The Emperor Hadrian. Emperors Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius. The Mosaic Gallery gives us an idea of the sumptuous interior decoration of private residences. This large marble and limestone floor came from a residential suburb of Antioch, present-day Antakya in Turkey. It dates to the late 5th century. In the center of a bed of roses stands the phoenix, the mythical bird repeatedly reborn from its own ashes, the symbol of immortality. When this mosaic was being made, the Roman Empire had begun to crumble, but the phoenix didn't die. The Renaissance undeniably took place. On the first floor of the small gallery, above the collections of Roman antiquities, is a long room designed in the 17th century by the architect Louvre and the painter Lebrun. The Apollo Gallery, named after the sun god, marks the emergence of the Louis XIV style. It's now occupied by the Department of Decorative Arts. Gold and silverwork, precious stones, and the crown jewels are all on view here. The Museum of Arts opened to the public at the Louvre in 1793, in the Great Gallery, the Square Room, and the Apollo Gallery. The artist Hubert Robert painted several views of the Great Gallery, both as he saw it at the time of its inauguration and as he wished it to be. The long-awaited Museum of Arts finally let everyone feast their eyes on the masterpieces assembled in the Crown Collection since the reign of François I. This king was a great art lover and had acquired 4 Raphaels, 4 Leonardos, and a portrait of himself by Titian. The department of paintings begins its display of Italian works in the square room. The Madonna of the Angels is a vast work by Cimabue, executed in about 1270. The Byzantine influence can still be seen in the frontal composition and the gold background, but the painter introduced a gentle modulation of volumes. Giotto, St. Francis of Assisi, is shown kneeling with his hands, feet and heart touched by rays emanating from Christ, represented as a 6-winged angel. Giotto amazed his contemporaries with his innovative, skillful manner of representing an ordinary man in a natural environment. The rays that fall on St. Francis, the rays of faith, are in the end perhaps more real than the arrows that pierce the body of St. Sebastian. Mantegna's art is symbolic. The living church set against the ruins of the pagan world. And perhaps the painter attaches more importance to forms, to the martyr's anatomy, to the picturesque quality of the city visible in the background. Paolo Uccello was said to have been obsessed by the effects of perspective, but here, reading from right to left, he also focuses on the analysis of movement. Then comes a series of portraits by Pisanello, Piero della Francesca, Antonello da Messina, Ghirlandaio, and Raphael. The Virgin and the Child with St. John the Baptist, traditionally known as La Belle Jardinière because of its rustic setting, is one of Raphael's most famous Madonnas. The composition of this group depicting St. Anne, the Virgin, and the Christ Child was once likened to a rotating pyramid. Leonardo da Vinci left his painting unfinished. The hazy bluish glaciers seem even stranger than the landscape behind La Gioconda, better known as the Mona Lisa. The portrait of the Mona Lisa has always been regarded as a masterpiece. At Fontainebleau, at the Louvre, at Versailles, the kings of France kept it close by. Napoleon wanted it in his bedroom at the Tuileries Palace. But we know that the Mona Lisa was in the Great Gallery in 1804. She was already one of the museum's priceless jewels. The questions we'd like to ask her: what lies behind that confident yet uncertain smile? Why is she so fascinating? Accounted by a look that is itself intensely but calmly quizzical. While the landscapes in the St. Anne and the Mona Lisa may evoke a primeval world, it was the evening twilight that Titian captured so well in The Entombment, where the body of Christ is half hidden in shadow. Just as prodigious a colorist as Titian, Paolo Veronese also worked in Venice. That is where he painted this immense canvas. Jesus performed the miracle of changing the water into wine at a wedding in Cana in Galilee. Veronese transposed this episode from the life of Christ into the sumptuous setting of 16th century Venice. Totally unlike this operatic scene with over 130 actors, on another stage, dramatized by a red curtain, a silent tragedy is played out before our eyes. The dead Virgin and the apostles surrounding her all look like ordinary people. Caravaggio breathed new life into religious painting by introducing the humblest everyday details into sacred art. The Louvre's rich collection of Italian art continues up to the end of the 18th century. The Republic of Venice was still organizing lavish celebrations already tinged with nostalgia when Francesco Guardi painted these fleeting light effects. With Gian Domenico Tiepolo, such festivities had become merely a series of grotesque gestures. Next to the abundant Italian collection, the Spanish paintings seem very limited in number, but they include some remarkable works. El Greco's Christ on the Cross, adored by two donors. Zurbaran's The Funeral of Saint Bonaventura. Murillo's Young Beggar. And Goya's portrait of the Marchesa della Solana. Still in the Denon wing, we now come to the collection of foreign sculpture. The Donatello Gallery earned its name from the bas-reliefs it contained by the Florentine sculptor and his workshop, especially a painted and gilded terracotta Madonna. The Christ child turns his head away from his mother as if his tragic destiny had already called him out of the frame of Donatello's work. This tall, polychrome limewood statue of Mary Magdalene, raised to the sky by angels, was carved by Gregor Erhardt in early 16th century Germany. The Michelangelo Gallery houses two well-known statues that were meant to adorn the tomb Pope Julius II had commissioned from the most celebrated sculptor of his time. Since the initial project was rejected in favour of a more modest monument, Michelangelo gave these two sculptures to an exiled Florentine, Roberto Strozzi, who in turn offered them as a tribute to the King of France. The rebel slave and the dying slave may well personify the arts reduced to servitude by the death of the Pope who protected them. Perhaps they also symbolize the human soul, subjugated by the weight of the body, attempting to free itself from the surrounding matter. Mercury carries Psyche away from Earth to Olympus to be united with Cupid. Trained in Florence, the Dutch sculptor Adrian de Vries executed this sinuous Mannerist work for Emperor Rudolf II's castle in Prague. At the other end of the same gallery stands Canova's marble masterpiece of 1793, Psyche and Cupid. The winged adolescent Cupid revives the soul that had lain at death's door. The paintings of the northern schools are exhibited in the Richelieu wing, on the other side of the pyramid. Throughout the Louvre Palace, painting is found on the highest floor so as to benefit from the overhead light coming through the glass roofs. "40 rooms present just under 900 paintings executed in Germany, Flanders, and Holland between the 15th and the 17th centuries. In his very famous picture that dates to about 1435, The Virgin of Autun, Jan van Eyck depicted the donor, the Duke of Burgundy's chancellor, kneeling in prayer. Everything is painted in meticulous detail. Chancellor Roland's face, his costume, the garden with 30 identifiable types of flowers, and the city in the background, bustling with activity. Van Eyck was one of the first artists to use oil to bind his pigments. The astonishing precision of the details enhances the subtleness of the overall composition and the impact of the religious symbolism. This self-portrait at the age of 22 is one of the earliest works painted by Albrecht Dürer, a leading figure of the German Renaissance. The Louvre owns 5 portraits painted by Hans Holbein the Younger. They were purchased by Louis XIV and include this one of the humanist Erasmus. The Moneylender and His Wife by Quentin Metzys. The picture is signed and dated 1514 on the parchment seen on a book above the head of the moneylender's wife. This is more than a simple genre scene. The scales the man is using may well symbolize the weighing of souls on the Day of Judgment. The Louvre's 52 Rubens form one of the world's finest collections of this artist's works. 24 of them relate semi-historic, semi-legendary episodes from the life of Queen Maria de' Medici, the wife of Henry IV. This one, for example, shows the birth of her son, the future Louis XIII. It took Rubens 3 years from 1622 to 1625 to paint these 24 vast canvases single-handed. Maria had commissioned them for a gallery in her newly built Luxembourg Palace. The room in which they are now on view at the Louvre was specially designed for this prestigious series. Rubens was also a painter of more intimate scenes. This is a portrait of his second wife, Hélène Fourment, with her children. In the 17th century Dutch painting rooms where we find Frans Hal's Jester with a lute. This one groups together a dozen works by Rembrandt. It includes his very moving portrait of Bathsheba, seen here just after she has read a letter from King David. On view further on are genre scenes such as Ter Borch's The Duet, Vermeer's The Lacemaker, and The Astronomer. Peter de Hooch's Woman Drinking, and Courtyard of a Dutch House, and landscapes, the most famous of which is perhaps Riesdale's Ray of Sunlight. Van Dyck, a Flemish painter who was Rubens' assistant, spent 9 years in England, where he became Charles I's official court painter. Van Dyck executed numerous portraits of the king, including this rather unconventional one. He was the founder of the English portrait school. In the 18th century, the conversation piece, the portrait group shown engaged in everyday occupations, was especially popular. One of its best exponents was Thomas Gainsborough with his Conversation in a Park of 1746 to 47. The Northern School's collections also include works dating to the late 18th century and the first half of the 19th century. Fuseli's Lady Macbeth Sleepwalking of 1784. Turner's Landscape with a river and a bay in the background, a painting the artist deliberately left unfinished around the year 1845. The Richelieu wing was built between 1852 and 1857 on the orders of Napoleon III, who thus completed the Bourbon king's great plan. The question of joining the Louvre to the Tuileries in the north, as Henry IV had done in the south, had been up in the air for years. Much of the Tuileries palace was destroyed by fire in 1871 during the Commune and had to be demolished. One of the stages of the recent Grand Louvre project involved converting the premises formerly occupied by the Ministry of Finance into a museum. The facades have now been restored. The interior has been redesigned to meet the needs of the museum. On the top floor, the Department of Paintings presents the collections we've just visited. Underneath, the Department of Decorative Arts displays not only precious works dating to the Middle Ages, but also enamels, goldsmithery, earthenware, bronzes, glassware, tapestries, and furniture of the Renaissance. An immense room has been specially designed to house the celebrated tapestry series featuring the 12 months of the year. Woven in Brussels between 1531 and 1533, after cartoons by Bernard van Orley, the 12 tapestries depict scenes of bird, deer, and boar hunting and are called the Maximilian's Hunt series, as for a long time one of the horsemen was thought to be Emperor Maximilian I. The dog attacking the huge boar is wearing a jack, a padded protective coat. Small painted enamel objects were very fashionable in the 16th century. Léonard Limousin perfected this difficult technique and specialized in portraits of members of the court. This one represents Anne de Montmorency, High Constable of France and friend of Henry II. The collections in this department continue to expand and include such exhibits as Madame Récamier's bedroom and the recent Grog Carven donation. Works dating to after 1848 are usually exhibited at the Musée d'Orsay, but there is one notable exception to the rule. And that is the sumptuous Second Empire apartments first occupied by Napoleon III's Minister of State, and then from 1871 to 1989 by the Ministry of Finance. Today they belong to the Department of Decorative Arts. On the ground floor of the Richelieu wing, around the spacious glass-covered courtyards, is a chronological display of French sculpture. 33 rooms enable visitors to follow its evolution from the 7th century onwards. Part of the collection came from the museum founded by Alexandre Lenoir during the Revolution in a former Augustinian monastery to house the works confiscated from religious communities and the émigrés. Other exhibits have been purchased since the late 19th century under the museum's active acquisition policy. Eight hooded figures are seen here carrying a stone ledger on their shoulders. On it is a recumbent knight whose hands are clasped in prayer. This is a monument to Philippe Pau, seneschal to the Duke of Burgundy, and Louis XI's chamberlain, who commissioned his tomb in 1480, 13 years before his death. Diana the Huntress is thought to have adorned a fountain in the grounds of the Château of Annay, the luxurious home of Diane de Poitiers, Henry II's mistress. It is the oldest piece of garden statuary in existence in France. Germain Pilon sculpted this huge marble statue for the funerary chapel of Henry II and his descendants. The resurrected Christ stands between two sleeping Roman soldiers. The 18th century rooms display works such as Houdon's Diana the Huntress. His bust of Voltaire, and Falconet's Bather. The immense glass roof over the former so-called Minister's Courtyard covers the sculptures that once stood among the trees in the grounds of the Château of Marly, where Louis XIV had built a smaller, more intimate castle than Versailles. At the far end of the domain, towering over the semicircular drinking trough, were two giant equestrian statues by Antoine Coisevaux. 40 years later, Guillaume Coustou's high-spirited horses restrained by grooms replaced Coisevaux's horses before joining them on the Place de la Révolution, the present-day Place de la Concorde. These four works of art were transferred to the Louvre in 1984. The ones seen in the Place de la Concorde today are casts. The variation in ground level in the old minister's courtyard gave rise to a terrace-like effect, highly appropriate for sculptures originally designed to stand in a park. It also facilitates the passage from one courtyard to another. Smaller than the Marly courtyard, the Puget courtyard is named after Pierre Puget, the sculptor whose works are exhibited here. His Milo of Crotona was sent to Versailles in 1683. It met with a warm reception, even though its subject and style were in direct opposition to the art favoured by the king and court. Milo was an ageing athlete who was trapped in a tree trunk he'd tried to split in half with his bare hands. He was devoured by a lion. Only gradually did the sculptures that decorated royal residences come to be thought of as a specific collection. Unlike the king's paintings, which form the core of the Department of Painting's collections. The French school represents over half of the works on view in this department. Around 700 paintings by French artists are exhibited in 80 rooms. French painting starts with a royal portrait of John the Good, King of France in 1350 and father of Charles V. A century later, with his half-length, almost front-view portrait of Charles VII, Jean Fouquet invented a model readopted by Jean Clouet around 1530 for a portrait of François I. The 15th century Avignon school produced intensely expressive works. In the Pieta of Villeneuve-les-Avignon, Enguerrand Carton placed the donor on the left in such a way that he was neither looking at the sacred scene nor the spectator, as if he had only an inner vision of the holy figures beside him. A long series of masterpieces represent 17th century France. Georges de la Tour's Cheat with the Ace of Diamonds. The rich, naive-looking young man on the right is about to be fleeced by his companions in a game of cards. The nearby interior scene, the peasant family, is by one or several of the Le Nain brothers. The solemn dignity of the figures seems to summon the same attentive gaze from the spectator. Claude Gelée, known outside France simply as Claude, used his imaginary landscapes containing Roman architecture as a vehicle for showing the changing light effects at different times of day. Poussin, who also settled in Rome, painted meditative works with themes drawn from the Bible, like the Judgment of Solomon seen here. In the last years of his life, afflicted by illness, in 4 famous paintings, he reflected on biblical episodes, on nature's eternal cycle, and the ages of man. Charles Lebrun's portrait of the Chancellor, Séguier, testifies to the taste for ceremonial pomp, which reaches its peak in Hyacinthe Rigaud's portrait of Louis XIV. During the Regency, after the splendour of the Sun King's golden age, light-hearted, nostalgic pleasure was the theme of Watteau's paintings, as in the pilgrimage to the island of Cythera, where the spectator may justifiably wonder whether the pilgrims are about to embark for or leave the Isle of Love. Among the figures in his Fête Galante and those borrowed from the Comédie dell'arte was Pierrot, who stands here enigmatically, arms dangling, while a donkey stares solemnly at the viewer. Fragonard was a brilliant portraitist. This one of Diderot clearly shows his talent. One of his masterful works is The Bolt, in which a long diagonal descends towards the apple of temptation on the table. While in Chardin's still lifes, a pure presence seems to emanate from commonplace objects. This self-portrait by Chardin is a pastel. It's too fragile to be placed on permanent exhibition. The Department of Graphic Arts has currently over 130,000 works on paper. Miniatures, drawings, watercolors, pastels, preparatory cartoons, and artist sketchbooks, as well as the 40,000 prints and drawings from the Edmond de Rothschild collection. These exhibits are highly sensitive to light, but may be viewed in the drawings department's large room. They are presented in temporary exhibitions focusing on various themes. A series of rooms throughout the painting circuit have been equipped to present drawings on a rota system. For example, here in this long gallery, whose bullseye windows overlook Perrault's colonnade. French painting of the late 18th century and the first half of the 19th century is found in rooms on the second floor of the square courtyard. Large-scale works dating to the same period attract thousands of visitors every day into the Denon Wing's famous Red Rooms. Louis David's Oath of the Horatians exalts the ancient Roman virtues of bravery, self-denial and patriotism, which revolutionary ethics would soon adopt. The canvas was painted in 1874 and marks the beginning of the neoclassical school. The coronation of Napoleon I is also by Louis David. To celebrate the event that took place in Notre-Dame de Paris in 1804, the painter portrays the moment when the emperor crowns his wife Josephine in the presence of Pope Pius VII and around 100 clearly recognizable guests. Among the best-known works in the room reserved for the Romantic movement, Géricault's Raft of the Medusa depicts the moment when the survivors of a shipwreck catch sight of a vessel that will perhaps come to their rescue. Delacroix's Liberty Guiding the People is an allegory of the revolutionary days of July 1830. As in the Raft of the Medusa, which Delacroix held in great esteem, the world of the living occupies the space above that of the dead. Ingres, an admirer of the 15th century Florentines and Raphael, became in turn a reference for Picasso and 20th century art. Corot was fond of the classical theory of idealized landscape and, at the same time, was a master of realism, with his studies painted in the open air. Is Souvenir of Mortefontaine a nostalgic souvenir of painting of the past? The unsophisticated yet skillful Corot, who could break away at will from his immense visual culture, calmly measures himself here against Leonardo da Vinci. No artist can avoid challenging his predecessors. The Louvre invites us, the spectators, to cast an active gaze so that the art of the past may live on in the present. Without this active participation, the works within its walls are merely objects from a distant age, closed windows, gates shut on the mists of time. The heritage we have been entrusted with and the right to enjoy it came without instructions for constantly reinvented use.